how it comes together, what it is about asbestos that makes it a dangerous material. And in order to do that, let's go back to the original discussions that we had about where asbestos comes from and what it's like. First of all, we said it is a mineral fiber that is a crystal. That means that it can break down into little bitty pieces that are mirror images or images of the big piece. Understand that asbestos is only a potential health hazard when the fibers are airborne. In other words, we talked earlier about asbestos coming out of a mine as a rock. Well, if you have a big rock of asbestos and you're sitting in the room that you're in and nobody ever does anything to that rock, then you're not going to have any problems with the material from the rock becoming airborne and creating a potential problem for the people that are in the room. That's not so. Think about chlorine gas. If you take liquid chlorine and you stick it in a container and you put it into a room, it would evaporate, evolve, the fumes would fill the room, and the people that are sitting in this room would basically pass out from exposure to chlorine. Well, asbestos is not that way. In order for there to be a hazard associated with asbestos, something has to be physically done to the material to release fibers and to get them into the air so that people that are occupying the space can breathe them. It goes back to the term friable. If you don't have a friable material, you don't have the risk for people to be exposed to asbestos. So how does this start? How does the disease start? Usually diseases that are associated with asbestos exposure are associated with the respiratory tract and lungs. And it starts by an individual inhaling these very small fibers, and the fibers getting past your body's immune system to a place where they can cause damage actually inside your body, like I said, normally in your respiratory tract or lungs. Although there are instances where asbestos-related diseases have shown up other places in people's bodies. These are very, very rare. One of the things that we'll discuss as we go through these diseases is a term that's called a latency period. One of the reasons that asbestos has the potential to be such a dangerous material with respect to disease is that it isn't like a lot of diseases where if you're exposed to pathogenic bacteria, 2 days later you come down with a bacterial disease, or if somebody sneezes at you that has the flu, then 2 or 3 days you come down with the flu. Well, there is typically an extended latency period associated with someone who is exposed to asbestos and the time that the person manifests the disease. This period of time between those two events is called the latency period, and we'll see as we go through that this is anywhere from 5 to 40 years. Now, your body has a natural immune system. It has the ability to fight off foreign bodies that come into it, bugs, different types of things, dusts, various types of particles and microorganisms that want to invade your body. Your body has 3 major systems that are able to ward off a lot of these. And it starts with your nose and your sinus cavities. Your body, if you're an adult, has hair inside your nose, and you've got a cavity at the back of your nose. And these two things serve a very useful purpose in life. They are the primary filtration devices for your respiratory tract. Big pieces of dirt get caught into your nose hairs, and there is mucus within your sinus cavities that sort of act like flypaper to collect various particles and residues that are inside the air. So that's actually a #1 way of taking out the big pieces, if you will, while somebody is involved in an environment where there may be dust, fibers, or other types of particles. Then the second method of defense that your body has is a system of cilia and mucous membranes that run along the back of your throat. You actually have cells that create mucus on the back of your throat going into your air passages, and there are very, very small hair-like projections that come out of these cells, and these are called cilia. If you think about seaweed at the bottom of the ocean, when a boat goes across and you see the seaweed blowing in one direction, then another when the waves come back, that's kind of like what happens to the cilia in your throat. During the evening, the smaller particles, as the day goes on, the smaller particles that aren't trapped by your nose hairs or your sinus cavities actually get trapped within this web of cilia and mucus during the day, and then when your body is at rest in the evening, there is a trigger mechanism that kind of has these cilia all moving in a general direction towards your nose, towards your nasal passages, and so it passes out during your sleep process a lot of this material that's accumulated. That's the reason a lot of times when the first thing you have to do when you wake up in the morning is blow your nose, is because this process isn't working. Then you have a process that is usually part of the body's antibiotic system where you have white blood cells. Everybody has white blood cells in their, that flow through their bloodstream, and these white blood cells or macrophages are organisms inside your body that try to fight off disease. When something gets into your body that isn't supposed to be there, your body's systems know to send warriors, or these white blood cells, to try to gather them up and haul them out. You get bacteria in your body, the body creates a lot of white blood cells. The white blood cells go and they wrap themselves all the way around these bacteria, and it's called engulfing. They actually wrap them up, grab them, the blood system takes them through your kidneys, and then you pass them out through your urinary tract, and that's the way that your body wards off disease a lot of times. And the body tries to do this to asbestos fibers and other types of residues, but it's not able to work that way all of the time. If you think about what we said earlier about asbestos particles being needle-like, they really are needle-like, they really are rigid, and one of the properties that we discussed is their ability to be long-term standing and chemically resistant. So your white blood cells really aren't effective in their ability to move these asbestos fibers out of your body. Now let's talk about what types of diseases there are that a person can contract with exposure to asbestos. The first type of disease that I want to discuss is a disease that's called asbestosis. Asbestosis is typically considered a disease that is a result of a relatively long-term exposure to elevated levels of asbestos fibers, commonly associated with people that work in asbestos mines, people that work in the insulating industry, people that work in the automotive industry back when there was asbestos material in brake lines. But basically what happens is you get an accumulator of asbestos fibers into the lungs, the air sacs in your lungs, and you're not able to inhale air anymore. When the sacs fill up with the dust or the asbestos fibers, then they create scarring. These air sacs or alveoli are no longer able to do their job, and the longer you're exposed to asbestos and the more asbestos they're exposed to, the more of these air sacs that get clogged up, and ultimately it creates a problem with the oxygen transfer system. When the blood goes to your lungs to get oxygen, there's a lot fewer places for it to get the oxygen to give off the carbon dioxide than in a normal person, simply because so many of these air sacs are full of asbestos or other types of dust. The latency period, we discussed the latency period from in an earlier conversation as being the period of time from the initial exposure to something until the time that a disease is manifested. Well, normally with asbestosis, this latency period is anywhere from 10 to 15 years. So it normally takes 10 or so years from the time that you have this initial exposure until the time that you actually are seen to have this asbestosis disease. Another type of disease that's associated with exposure to asbestos is lung cancer. Lung cancer is a tumor. It's created by a tumor that grows in your lungs, where the source of the tumor, the primary source of the tumor, actually is an asbestos fiber or asbestos fiber bundles, to where your body starts to create this system to try to move the asbestos out of your lungs, and it isn't successful in being able to do that. So over time, this tumor forms. If you think about your lungs as a sponge, which is very similar to a sponge, and you think about an asbestos fiber as a needle, it's very hard. You can imagine how complicated or difficult it would be to move a needle out of a sponge, even with all of the white blood cells that your body could possibly amass. So over time, this can create a tumor at the site where the asbestos fiber is, and over the course of time, this tumor can become malignant. And if it does become malignant, then it is a lung cancer tumor that was formed as a result of exposure to asbestos fibers. Normally, the latency period for this is anywhere from 25 to 35 years. So if you're going to have lung cancer from an exposure to asbestos, it's not going to typically manifest itself for anywhere from 20 to 25 years after the exposure occurred. That's one of the reasons that the federal government has promulgated these rules specifically geared towards children, because children that are exposed to asbestos have a much longer anticipated life cycle, and from that standpoint, they're most likely candidates to have these diseases and be able to make it through these latency periods. The final disease that I'm going to talk about is a disease called mesothelioma. Mesothelioma is a specific type of cancer that's associated with the lining of the lungs that is caused only by asbestos exposure. You have a very thin layer around the exterior of your lungs that is a lot like saran wrap, and when an asbestos fiber migrates its way through and gets into this lining, which is called the mesoderm or the mesothelial lining, it can also cause a tumor very similar to what we were discussing with the lung cancer, but it is in a spot where there is no way to operate on it at all. There is no other there is no other item in nature that causes mesothelioma, with the exception of asbestos, so it's confirmed that it can cause this type of cancer. The one thing about mesothelioma is that in 99% of the cases for people who contract the disease, it's fatal. There aren't a lot of people that get it, but the people that get it, there isn't a cure for it. The latency period for mesothelioma is usually 30 to 40 years. It's a little bit longer than lung cancer, maybe more, maybe less, but it normally takes a very extended period of time for this exposure. So these are the three major diseases that we are going to discuss that are caused by exposure to asbestos. That would be asbestosis, lung cancer, mesothelioma. And although the opportunity or potential for exposure are minimal, there nonetheless is an opportunity for this to occur, and that's why we exercise caution in trying to put regulations together to keep people from being exposed to these materials. Another item somewhat related to health effects, but most significantly related to a combination of adverse effects on you that EPA suggests strenuously that we discuss in these classes, is the relationship between smoking and asbestos. There's a term that we use called a synergistic effect, where the effect of two things that are bad for you that you are involved with at the same time having much stronger effect on you than either of them individually or both of them together from a sum perspective. So people who smoke are about 10 times more likely than the normal population to become affected with lung cancer. And people that are exposed to asbestos for a reasonable period of time are about 5 times more likely to contract an asbestos-related disease such as cancer. But there have been studies that have linked smoking and asbestos exposure in a way that creates the synergistic effect to where somebody who is a smoker who is exposed to asbestos actually has about a 50-time greater risk of contracting some form of cancer than a person in the normal population who is neither a smoker nor someone who has been exposed to asbestos fibers. So there certainly is a substantial risk associated with somebody that is involved with asbestos exposure and cigarette smoking. There's information available through EPA to help you if you have an interest in stopping smoking if you're a smoker, and certainly information associated with minimizing your risk of asbestos exposure, part of which is what we're trying to do today. So let's change gears here a little bit and get out of the conversations about asbestos disease and asbestos exposure and talk a little bit about the specific rules and regulations that have been established for dealing with asbestos. The first organization that has developed rules is an organization by the name of OSHA. That stands for the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. There is an air rule that was part of the Clean Air Act that is called NESHAP. And NESHAP stands for the National Emission Standard for Hazardous Air Pollutants. The third rule that was promulgated that deals with asbestos is AHERA. AHERA is also known as the Asbestos in Schools Rule. It stands for the Asbestos Hazard Emergency Response Act. And we will find as we discuss this that this applies to all not-for-profit schools, kindergarten through the 12th grade. And it established specific requirements for these schools that don't apply to the other facilities and buildings that exist in the United States. And then finally, there are rules and regulations dealing with the proper transportation and disposal of asbestos through a waste management entity. The Division for Waste Management is the entity within Kentucky that regulates this, and we'll talk about what those rules are a little bit in this conversation. So let's go specifically to OSHA right now, because OSHA probably is the most confusing of these rules. But if we get to OSHA, you understand that it deals specifically with worker protection. It's involved in dealing with the protection of people that occupy premises as employees, and it deals both with their exposure in a non-construction environment. The OSHA standard that relates to this is the OSHA General Industry Standard. That applies to secretaries, it applies to teachers, it applies to truck drivers, it applies to any employee that is operating, that is working within an environment where there is asbestos materials. Once you get into a process where there are asbestos activities going on, whether these are asbestos removal or asbestos cleanups or anything that would actually disturb asbestos, there is an OSHA standard called the Construction Industry Standard that applies to the people who are actually doing the work that disturbs the asbestos. So we have, under OSHA, we have a general industry standard that deals with daily activities and people who are not involved in disturbing asbestos. When we get into disturbing asbestos, we get along into the rule that's called the OSHA Construction Industry Standard. So let's briefly discuss the general industry standard. It's the standard that is applicable, first of all, for building maintenance and custodial personnel. The general industry standard is the industry standard for asbestos that applies to maintenance personnel and custodial personnel as long as their responsibilities do not involve specifically disturbing asbestos. The construction industry standard, as we indicated earlier, is a standard that involves for people that disturb asbestos in the workplace. So if you are a custodian and you're doing something that disturbs asbestos, then you get involved in a different type of regulation, which is the construction regulation, and the standards are much more stringent. and require certain types of things that normal maintenance and custodial workers aren't going to be trained for or equipped to do, so that in general, the process within schools is to avoid anything that disturbs the asbestos materials. So there is a permissible exposure limit. This is what triggers an activity under OSHA, under the general industry standard, and that is you can't have more than 1 fiber of asbestos per cubic centimeter of air. This is a standard that the units really aren't that relevant. It suffices to say that under normal circumstances there isn't any way that an environment can exceed this personal exposure level unless something is being done to disturb the asbestos. And you can determine whether or not an area exceeds this standard by certain types of exposure monitoring, testing the concentrations of asbestos in the air to determine if somebody is or isn't being exposed to that level. OSHA also has a requirement for communicating information about asbestos in the workplace to the people that are there. Certain types of requirements for labeling and signage in areas where common areas maintenance is going on. Training such as we're doing today so that people are aware of the issues associated with asbestos and the things that they can do to prevent the release of asbestos or making asbestos friable. And there are specific standards for housekeeping, how you are supposed to do your jobs in areas that have asbestos, and record keeping. We'll talk some about this housekeeping in a later area of our presentation. So now that we have OSHA, we're going to discuss 2 of the other air regulations that deal with asbestos. The first one is the NESHAP regulation. As I said earlier, this is the National Emission Standard for Hazardous Air Pollutants. When the Clean Air Act was adopted in the 1970s, the people that promulgated this rule, EPA and Congress, they assigned certain types of air contaminants as hazardous. One of them was asbestos. It generally was introduced into the Clean Air Act under the NESHAP portion to prevent the release of asbestos into the air, the outside air, through smokestacks at asbestos mining and process operations.